A widow was raising 6 children in a leaking barn with no floor and no fire. The first nail I drove into that barn came out the other side of a rotten plank and hit nothing, just air and cold. I pulled it, moved 2 inches left, tried again. That one held. That's how I started. Not with a plan, not with any notion of how it would go. One nail at a time, in a barn that had no business standing. Her name was Clara Prout. She'd been Luther Prout's wife until March, when Luther fell off a hay wagon and didn't get up again. Left her with 6 kids, a homestead claim that wasn't proven out yet, $300 in debt at the feed store, and a barn that a good sneeze might have brought down. I didn't know her well. I'd seen her at church, seen her at the store in Harlow. She had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a way of looking at a thing that made you think she was already working out how to fix it before you finished explaining the problem. I had a spread 3 miles east of hers. Nothing grand. 200 acres of mixed grass and creek bottom, enough cattle to keep me occupied, a 1-room house I'd built with my own hands 14 years before and never quite finished. There was a loft I always meant to close in and never did. A window on the south side without glass in it. I'd hung a piece of oilskin there the first winter and just kept rehanging it. The kind of things a man lets go when there's no one to notice. I was 51 years old. Had been married once, 20 years back, a woman named Ruth who died of fever in the 2nd year and took the child with her. I don't talk about that. I mention it only because it is the shape of the hole that was in me, and shapes matter. I heard about Clara Prout's situation from Denny Alcott at the feed store the last week of March. Denny said it like he was reporting weather, said she had no money, no man, no means, and 6 mouths to eat through whatever she had stored. Said the oldest boy was 10. Said the barn roof had gone to pieces in the February ice storm, and she'd been keeping the livestock in the front room of the house, which was the only heated space she had. I bought my goods and drove home, thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, I loaded my wagon with lumber I had stacked behind the barn, planks I'd been saving for that loft, and drove west. She was in the yard when I pulled up, hauling a bucket from the well. She set it down and looked at me without any expression I could read. I told her I'd heard about the barn. She said she hadn't asked for help. I said I knew that. I told her I had lumber I wasn't using and time I could spare if she didn't object to me working on the roof. She stood there looking at me for a long moment, just looking the way she did, and then she picked up her bucket and said she'd put coffee on. That was the whole conversation. That was all there was. I got up on that roof the same afternoon. The damage was worse than Denny had let on. 3 of the main rafters had cracked under the ice load, and the whole south section had dropped 8 inches, pulling the siding off the top plate. It wasn't a matter of patching. I'd have to take it down and reframe it. I stood on what was left of the roof and looked at it and started working out the order of things in my head. The oldest boy, whose name was James, came out and stood below me looking up. He had his father's coloring, dark-skinned and square-faced, and he wasn't going to let himself look impressed. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I was figuring out how to fix his barn roof. He said his mother hadn't asked me to. I said I knew that too. He helped me all afternoon without being asked and without saying much. He had good hands for a 10-year-old. Knew how to hold a board without being told. I gave him work he could do, and he did it. I went back the next day and the day after that. I worked my own place in the mornings. The cattle still had to be seen to. The fences didn't care about anyone's widow, and drove to Clara's after midday and worked until dark. She fed me supper both nights without making a thing of it. The children ate and went to their pallets, and she and I sat at the table with the lamp between us and didn't say much. She asked once how the framing was going. I told her I'd have the new rafters cut by Friday. She nodded and poured more coffee. On Friday night after supper, she asked why I was doing it. Not suspiciously, just straight on, like it was a fair question she'd been holding and decided to ask. I thought about giving her a polished answer. I didn't have one. I said, because someone needed to and I was able to. Because Luther Prout had always been decent to me, and his kids deserved a barn. Because I had the lumber and I had the time, and it would have sat wrong with me to drive past that place knowing what I knew. She looked at me across the table. The lamp was between us, and I could see the tiredness in her face and something under the tiredness that hadn't given up. She said, all right. That was all she said. All right. Like she was accepting the explanation at its honest value and filing it away. I drove home in the dark, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't satisfaction, quite. More like being in the right place for the first time in a while. April came in cold and wet. I finished the barn roof on a Wednesday and started on the floor that same week. She had no floor in the barn, just packed dirt, which turns to mud in a wet spring and makes everything harder. I had a pile of rough-cut oak planks I'd milled the previous fall that I hadn't yet figured a use for, and I loaded them and brought them over. She came out and looked at the load and said, "You don't have to do the floor too." I said I knew that. She had 2 milk cows, a draft horse, 4 pigs, and a flock of chickens that had been living in the front room since February. Getting them back into the barn let her scrub the front room down, which took her 2 days of hard work and left her looking like she'd been wrung out. I was still there when she finished. She came out to the barn where I was laying planks and stood in the doorway and said, "It smells like a house again in there," like she couldn't quite believe it. I just kept working, but I heard her. There were 6 children, James the oldest at 10. Then the girls, Margaret and Rose, 8 and 6. Then the twins, boys, 5, named for Clara's brothers, Henry and Walt. And the youngest, a girl called Bess, who had just turned 3 and had her mother's dark eyes and no fear of anything. They got used to me being around. The younger ones, especially, by the middle of April, they'd come out to the barn after school and sit on the new floor and watch me work. Bess would sit right next to wherever I was working, close enough to touch, and ask me things with no filter on her at all. Asked me once why my hands were so rough. I told her from working. She thought about that and said her papa's hands had been rough too. I said I know, the work does it. I thought about that all the way home. About her saying it so plain, just a fact she was carrying around. 3 years old, filing things away the way her mother did. I didn't have any plan beyond the barn and the floor. I told myself I'd finish those and then go back to my own place and let her manage. She was capable. She was more capable than most men I knew. She'd been managing since March on nerve alone, and the nerve was real. But there was a fence on the north side that was down in 3 places and cattle could get through. I fixed that. There was a gate hinge that had rusted through and the gate was hanging on a wire. I replaced that. There was a water problem. Her well was shallow and going silty, and when I looked at it I could see why. The casing had cracked and soil was getting in. That took me 4 days to fix right, pulling the old casing sections out and resetting them. She came out and stood by the well when I was down in it and looked down at me with a lantern and handed me tools when I asked for them and didn't say much and didn't leave. At some point I stopped pretending I was going to finish and go back to my own place. I was there most afternoons. I was there for supper more often than not. Her children were starting to wait for me at the fence when they heard my wagon. I kept telling myself that was a problem I'd deal with. I kept not dealing with it. The first time she touched me was in May. I'd cut the heel of my right hand on a splinter that had run up under the skin and festered, and she saw me favoring it and made me sit down, and she worked it out with a needle she'd sterilized in the lamp flame. I sat at her table, and she sat across from me and held my hand in both of hers and worked at the thing while I held still. Her hands were small and strong and sure. She got the splinter out and pressed the heel of my palm until it bled clean, and then bandaged it with a strip of linen and tied it off. She held my hand a moment longer than she needed to, and then let it go and stood up. That was all it was. She was just being sensible about a wound. But I sat there for a minute after she went to the stove, and the feeling I had was not something I could afford to think about too long. James came to me at the end of May. Came out to the barn one evening when I was done for the day and just cleaning up. He stood there the way he did, square and cautious, and then he said, "Are you going to stay?" I looked at him. He was looking at the floor the way a 10-year-old looks at something when he's working to control his face. I said, "I don't know, James. That's not something I can answer on my own." He thought about that, then he said, "The others are starting to count on you." And then he walked out, just like that, like he'd said the one thing he'd been sent to say and the rest was up to me. I sat there in that barn for a while after he left. Sat on a hay bale and looked at the floor I'd laid and the walls I'd patched and the rafters I'd framed, and I thought about what it meant to count on someone, what it meant to be counted on, whether I was still the kind of man who could carry that. I'd been running my own place alone for 19 years, long enough that alone had started to feel like the natural order. Not comfortable, exactly. You don't get comfortable with something like that, but settled. Like a way of being you've stopped trying to change. I drove home that night without going in for supper. I needed to think with some space around me. I lay awake most of the night looking at the oilskin on my south window and listening to the creak and doing the arithmetic of it in my head. The arithmetic was not complicated. A widow with 6 children needed more than a fixed barn roof. She needed someone who was going to show up every day for years. Someone who was going to be there when the fence went down again, when the wells silted up again, when the cattle got sick or the crops came in wrong or James turned 14 and needed a man to show him things. She needed someone who had already decided to stay before he was asked, because being asked was already too late, already a burden she shouldn't have to carry. I had 200 acres and no one on them. I had a house I'd never finished building and had no particular reason to finish. I had cattle enough and skill enough and time enough. I was 51, not 80. There was still work left in me. The question was not whether I could do it. The question was whether I was willing to let myself want it. That took me until about 3 in the morning to answer. I was back at her place before noon the next day. She was hanging wash on the line out back, and the little one, Bess, was chasing a chicken around the yard. Clara looked up when she heard the wagon, same as always, and she saw something in my face because she put down what she was holding. I got down from the wagon. I walked over to where she was standing. I told her I'd been thinking. I told her I didn't have a polished way to say what I wanted to say, and I was going to say it plain. I told her I was there because I wanted to be there, not because of obligation, and that James had asked me last night if I was going to stay, and I thought the fairest thing was to ask her the same question before I decided anything. Whether she wanted me to stay, whether that was something she could consider. She looked at me for a long time. The wash was moving a little in the wind. Bess had caught the chicken and was carrying it around triumphantly. Clara said, "I've known since April that I wanted you to stay. I was waiting to see if you'd figure it out yourself." I looked at her. She was looking straight at me, the way she always did, like she'd already worked out the problem and was just waiting on me to catch up. I said, "I'm a little slow." She said, "I noticed." I laughed. I don't think I'd laughed in months. It came out rough and strange, like a door that doesn't get used, and she smiled when she heard it, and the smile was the most unguarded thing I'd ever seen on her face. We stood there in the yard for a minute. Bess wandered over with the chicken still under her arm and looked up at me and said, "Are you staying for supper?" I looked at Clara. Clara said, "If you're asking him, ask him right." Bess looked up at me very seriously and said, "Are you staying for supper, please?" I said yes, I was. That was the conversation. That's how it went. Not much to it and everything to it. We were married in July. The preacher came out from Harlow on a Saturday morning and did it in the yard under the cottonwood tree Clara's first husband had planted. James stood up with me. Margaret and Rose made a fuss of Bess's hair. The twins fell into the creek before the ceremony and had to be dried out and threatened. It was about as dignified as you'd expect with 6 children involved, which is to say it wasn't dignified at all and didn't need to be. I moved my cattle over and sold my own place that fall, kept the better of my 2 horses and the tools and the things that were mine. The oilskin I left on the window. Whoever bought the place could sort out the window themselves. The farm was not easy. I want to be plain about that. A widow's homestead claim with 6 children and a winter coming and money still tight at the feed store. There's no version of that which is easy. I worked harder than I had in years. I was up before light and down after dark, and some days I was moving on nothing but habit and the knowledge that the work had to be done. That first winter, Clara's youngest, Henry, one of the twins, got sick with a lung ailment and we almost lost him. That was the worst of it. 3 weeks of that, watching him fight it. Watching Clara sit up with him nights and come down in the mornings with her face set hard, and doing what needed to be done before she let herself think about whether he was going to make it. He made it. He's a strong kid. All 6 of them are strong. They're their mother's children. What I didn't expect, what I wasn't prepared for, was how it felt to be needed like that. By all of them. By the little ones who'd wait at the fence for me after school, and by James, who was learning to work beside me and already showing he was going to be better at most things than I was, and by Bess, who would climb into my lap after supper with no warning and fall asleep there as if she'd decided I was the most reliable piece of furniture in the house, and by Clara. Not a needy woman, nothing like that. She needed me the way a person needs a partner. She expected me to hold my end, and I did, and she held hers, and that was the arrangement. And in that arrangement, she trusted me in a way I had not been trusted since Ruth. I carry it every day. There's a particular thing she does that I have never said out loud to anyone. At the end of the day, when supper's done and the children are down and we are sitting at the table together, sometimes talking, sometimes just there, she'll reach across and put her hand over mine. not making anything of it, not even looking at me half the time. Just her hand on mine like she's reminding herself I'm there. Or reminding me, I don't know which. I know what I was before she did that. I was a man running out his years on a half-finished piece of ground with an oilskin on his window, and the main feeling I had about my own life was that the best parts of it were behind me, and I had made my peace with that. I know what I am now. I am the man this family counts on. I am the man who knows where every weak board is in that barn and every shallow spot in that creek when it floods, and what each of those children needs when they're sick or scared or quiet in the wrong way. I am the man Clara looks at across the supper table when something is funny or wrong or worrying, because I'm the one she works things out with now. I am the rock of this place. I did not expect to be the rock of anything again. She is not a sentimental woman. She does not say things just to say them. When she says she is glad I came that first day with my wagon load of lumber, I believe her. When she says she does not know what she would have done, I believe that too. When she puts her hand on mine at the end of a long day, I understand what she means by it. She means you showed up. You kept showing up. That is not a small thing. She is right, it isn't. Last spring I finally closed in the loft in the house. It was a thing I'd been meaning to do since I moved in. Clara asked why it had taken me so long. I told her I hadn't had a reason to before. She thought about that for a moment and then she said, well, you do now. James uses it for sleeping. There's a window up there, a real one with glass, that looks east over the creek bottom, and in the mornings the light comes through it and hits the floor of the main room, and that's the light I wake up to now. There was a morning in September, this past fall, when I got up before Clara and went out to the barn to see to the cattle. And when I came back, she was at the stove with her back to me, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something she was baking, and the two youngest were still asleep on their pallets, and James was already up and out somewhere doing his morning check like he does, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it all. I'd driven 3 miles west one day in April with a wagon load of lumber I wasn't using. That's all it was. One decision made because I could make it and the work was there to be done. I stood in that doorway and looked at the life that was in that kitchen, and I thought about the man I'd been before, with his oilskin window and his empty place, and his sense that the best of it was already past. I thought about how wrong a man can be about himself without knowing it. Clara turned around and saw me standing there, and she looked at me the way she does, like she's already got the measure of whatever I'm carrying and doesn't need it explained. She said, come in and close the door. You're letting the heat out. I came in, I closed the door. The coffee was hot and she put a cup in my hand without being asked, and sat down across from me, and the morning light came through the east window the way it does in September, slant and gold, and lay across the table between us. I was exactly where I was supposed to be,